Steve Harvey abandoned his carefully planned show when a desperate mother stepped onto his stage. What began as an ordinary taping quickly turned into one of the most powerful moments in television history. The famous host, known for his quick wit, suddenly went completely off script, breaking every rule of production. Nobody expected what would happen next, especially the homeless mother, who had nothing left to lose. What Steve did next didn't just surprise the audience, it changed lives forever. It was just another day on the Steve Harvey Show. The studio lights blazed with their characteristic intensity, casting everything in a warm, flattering glow. The audience erupted in thunderous applause as Steve took his seat, their energy electric and palpable throughout the cavernous studio. Everything was running exactly according to the meticulously planned schedule that had been perfected over years of broadcasting excellence. Steve sat in his iconic chair, charming the crowd with his signature humor, making them laugh at every perfectly timed joke. His timing was impeccably: a pause here, a raised eyebrow there, a self-deprecating comment that landed like clockwork. The producers were happy, watching the show unfold on their monitors with satisfaction. The audience was entertained, hanging on his every word. The guest was performing beautifully, hitting their talking points. Everything was going exactly as it always did, smooth as silk, predictable as sunrise. But then something happened that no one saw coming. A commotion erupted, backstage, urgent whispers, shuffling feet, the sound of mild chaos breaking through the controlled environment. Security guards suddenly appeared, looking confused and slightly flustered. They were escorting someone, moving quickly but carefully. A woman appeared backstage, disheveled, worn down by life's relentless weight, her clothes hanging loose on her thin frame as if she'd lost significant weight recently. Her hair was unkempt, her face weathered beyond her years. She wasn't part of the guest list. She wasn't scheduled. She hadn't been vetted by producers or prepared by makeup artists. She had somehow slipped through security, desperate and determined, driven by a mother's fierce need to be heard. The producers immediately moved to remove her, their professionalism kicking in as they tried to maintain the show's carefully controlled environment. But Steve caught sight of her in that split second before she disappeared behind the curtain, and he saw something in her eyes that stopped him cold. It wasn't just sadness, though. Sadness was certainly there, etched into every line of her face. It wasn't just desperation, though. Desperation radiated from her like heat from a furnace. It was something deeper, something primal. It was the look of someone who had absolutely nothing left, someone on the edge of complete collapse, standing at the precipice of total devastation. A mother at her breaking point, pushed beyond what any human should have to endure. A human being screaming silently for help, begging without words for someone, anyone, to notice her suffering in that fraction of a second. Steve Harvey made a choice. He did something his producers never expected. He stopped mid-interview, cutting off the guest mid-sentence. He held up his hand, a gesture that commanded immediate attention, and he asked security to bring her back. Bring back the woman who wasn't supposed to be there, the interruption that threatened to derail the entire show. The audience fell silent. The applause died. The laughter stopped. You could hear a pin drop in that massive studio. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment. Nobody knew what was about to happen, but everyone could feel that something monumental was shifting in that studio, something that transcended the usual entertainment formula. The air itself seemed to change, charged with anticipation and emotion. What Steve saw in those desperate eyes would force him to make a decision that would change multiple lives forever. The woman stepped forward slowly, almost hesitantly, as if she couldn't quite believe this was actually happening. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to give way at any moment, and she clutched a worn fabric bag to her chest like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. The studio lights felt harsh and unforgiving on her face, exposing every line, every tear stain, every mark that hardship had etched into her skin over months of struggle and sleepless nights. She looked small on that stage, fragile and vulnerable, like a strong wind could knock her over. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, a defensive posture developed from too many rejections and too much pain. She was wearing clothes that had been washed too many times, faded and worn at the edges, but they were meticulously clean, suggesting that despite her circumstances, she still clung to her dignity. Steve's expression had completely transformed in an instant. The jovial entertainer was gone, replaced by something rawer, more genuine, more profoundly human. The smile that had been plastered on his face moments before disappeared entirely. He stood up from his chair with purpose and walked toward her, his usual theatrical movements replaced by deliberate, respectful steps. His body language communicated respect and compassion in a way that words couldn't. When he reached her, he didn't shake her hand formally or offer the typical talk show greeting. Instead, he gently took her arm and guided her to sit down, treating her with the kind of dignity that made the entire audience lean forward in their seats, sensing that something sacred was happening before their eyes. "What's your name?" Steve asked softly, his voice stripped of its usual comedic edge and carefully constructed charm. There was no performance in his tone, just genuine human curiosity and concern. "I'm Maria," she whispered, barely audible even in the silent studio. Her voice was so quiet that people in the back rows had to strain to hear her, and that quietness itself spoke volumes about her broken spirit. What happened next was unlike anything the producers had prepared for in their meticulously planned run sheets. Maria began to speak, her voice trembling and breaking as she shared snippets of her story, pieces of a larger narrative of struggle and survival that had brought her to this moment of desperation. She talked about losing her job 6 months ago when the company downsized without warning. She had been a receptionist at a dental office, a job she'd held for 8 years, and suddenly it was gone. She talked about the eviction notice that had arrived 2 weeks prior, delivered by a process server who wouldn't make eye contact. She talked about her 2 children, a 7-year-old daughter named Sophia and a 9-year-old son named Marcus, sleeping in her car every night in a parking lot across town. A parking lot she'd chosen specifically because it was well lit and near a 24-hour diner where she could use the bathroom. As Maria spoke, Steve's expression shifted from compassionate listening to something deeper, genuine anguish that seemed to consume him. His jaw tightened visibly, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. His hands clenched and unclenched as he listened to her story. He wasn't performing anymore. He was truly present, truly hearing her, truly absorbing the weight of what she was enduring. The producers in the control room were frantically gesturing to each other, unsure how to handle this unprecedented deviation from the script. Some were checking their watches, others were on their phones, calling executives. This wasn't what daytime television was supposed to be. This was supposed to be light, entertaining, escapist. But this was real. This was raw. This was unpredictable and uncontrollable, and it terrified the people whose job it was to manage every second of airtime. Maria's voice cracked dangerously as she described her daughter, asking why they couldn't go home, why they had to sleep in the car, why other kids at school got to talk about their bedrooms and their toys, but she couldn't. She talked about rationing food, about buying the cheapest items at the grocery store and stretching them across multiple meals. She talked about choosing between gas money and groceries, about the impossible mathematics of poverty where every dollar had to be stretched impossibly thin. She talked about the shame of being a mother who couldn't provide basic shelter for her children, the crushing weight of that failure, the way it ate at her soul every single day. She talked about her son getting sick last month and being terrified to take him to the hospital because she couldn't afford it, couldn't afford the debt that would pile on top of her already insurmountable debt. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, and the entire studio seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a moment of collective recognition of human suffering. Steve reached over and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything in that moment. He wasn't treating her like a guest or a story to be exploited for ratings. He was treating her like a human being in crisis, a mother in need, a person worthy of respect and dignity. His thumb gently rubbed the back of her hand in a gesture of comfort that transcended the typical talk show interaction. "How long have you been living in your car?" Steve asked, his voice thick with emotion, each word carefully chosen. 4 months, Maria replied, her voice barely above a whisper, each word seeming to cost her something. I've been looking for work every single day, Steve. Every single day. I wake up at 5 in the morning and I go to job interviews. I fill out applications. I network. I've tried everything, but nobody wants to hire someone who doesn't have a permanent address. They see that I am homeless and they stop listening. I've tried everything, Steve. I've tried so hard, and I am still failing my children. That is when Steve made his decision, the moment that would define this entire episode and become the subject of countless articles and social media posts. The producers could see it happening on their monitors, the exact moment when Steve Harvey decided to completely abandon the script, to ignore the producers in his ear, to disregard the carefully timed commercial breaks and segment transitions. He squeezed Maria's hand firmly and looked directly into the camera, his eyes blazing with determination and righteous anger at the injustice of her situation. "We're going to fix this," he said simply, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Not after the show, not next week, not sometime in the future. Today, right now, we're going to fix this." The audience erupted, but it wasn't the usual applause and cheers that punctuated his jokes. It was something different, something that felt like collective recognition of a moment that mattered, a moment where entertainment transformed into humanity, where a television show became a vehicle for actual change. People stood up from their seats. Some were crying. Others were clapping so hard their hands hurt. The energy in the studio had fundamentally shifted, but what the audience witnessed next left everyone in the studio completely speechless, and what would unfold over the next hour would become one of the most talked about moments in daytime television history. Steve turned to his production team, his expression brooking no argument. "I want every resource we have," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Get me her landlord's information, get me her former employer, get me housing resources, job placement services, everything. And I want it now." The producers scrambled into action, their initial shock giving way to the realization that this was happening whether they liked it or not. Phone calls were made, laptops were opened. Within minutes, a coordinated effort was underway that transcended the typical talk show format entirely. Steve turned back to Maria, who sat trembling in her chair, still unable to fully comprehend what was happening. "Maria, I need you to trust me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We're going to solve this today, but I need you to answer some questions for me. Can you do that?" Maria nodded, tears still streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she gripped the armrests of her chair. Over the next 20 minutes, Steve conducted what amounted to a crisis intervention session on live television. He asked Maria about her skills, her work history, her education. He learned that she had taken some college courses but hadn't finished her degree due to financial constraints. She had experience in customer service, office management, and administrative work. She was bilingual, fluent in both English and Spanish. She was intelligent, articulate, and clearly desperate to work. As Maria answered his questions, Steve's team was making calls behind the scenes. They contacted local housing authorities. They reached out to job placement agencies. They called business owners in the area who had expressed interest in participating in community outreach programs. The machinery of Steve Harvey's influence and resources was being mobilized in real time. Then Steve did something extraordinary. He called his friend and fellow entrepreneur, a successful real estate developer who had appeared on his show multiple times. "Marcus, I need a favor," Steve said into the phone, which was being broadcast to millions of viewers. "I have a mother of 2 who needs emergency housing. Can you help me find her something affordable, something she can move into immediately?" There was a pause, and then Marcus's voice came through the speaker. "Steve, you know I've got some properties. Let me make some calls. I'll get back to you within the hour." The audience erupted again, but this time it was different. This wasn't just applause for Steve's generosity. It was recognition that something real was happening, that a system was being activated to help someone in genuine need. But Maria wasn't the only one affected by what was unfolding. In the audience, a woman named Jennifer sat with tears streaming down her face. She was a human resources director for a major corporation, and she had come to the show expecting to watch entertainment. Instead, she was witnessing a moment of profound humanity that was shaking her to her core. During the commercial break, Jennifer made her way backstage. She found a producer and told them she wanted to speak with Maria. Within minutes, Jennifer was sitting across from Maria in a green room, and she was offering her a real job with benefits, with a salary that would allow her to get her children out of the car and into a home. When they returned to the air after the commercial break, Steve announced the news to a studio that had transformed into something resembling a revival meeting. The audience cheered and cried as Maria learned that she had employment, that her future was no longer a complete unknown, that her children would have a home. But Steve wasn't finished. He had another surprise waiting. "Maria," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion, "I've been thinking about your children. Sophia and Marcus deserve to know that their mother's sacrifice is being recognized. So I've made some arrangements." He gestured to the side of the stage, and a door opened. Two figures emerged, a man and a woman, both carrying large gift bags. They were representatives from a local furniture store and a children's clothing retailer. They explained that they were donating everything Maria would need to furnish an apartment: beds, dressers, kitchen table, chairs, and clothing for both children. Maria collapsed into tears, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her circumstances. She had come to this studio as a desperate woman with nothing, and within the span of an hour, her entire life had been transformed. She had a job. She had housing prospects. She had furniture. She had hope. But the most powerful moment came when Steve asked Maria to speak directly to her children, who were watching from home with relatives who had taken them in temporarily. "Sophia, Marcus," Maria said, her voice breaking with emotion, "Mommy wants you to know that everything is going to be okay now. We going to have a real home. You going to have real beds and a real kitchen. And you going to be able to invite your friends over. Mommy is so sorry for what you've had to go through, but we made it. We going to make it." The studio fell completely silent. Even the producers, usually focused on timing and transitions, seemed to have forgotten about their jobs. This was no longer a television show. This was a moment of human connection and redemption that transcended the medium entirely. As the episode drew to a close, Steve addressed the audience directly. "What you've witnessed today isn't just about Maria," he said, his voice carrying profound weight. "It's about recognizing that there are millions of people just like her out there, people who are doing everything right and still struggling. People who need help, who need community, who need us to remember that we all connected." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If you watching this and you struggling like Maria was, I want you to know that help is available. And if you watching this and you have resources, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember Maria's face and her children's names. And I want you to ask yourself what you can do to help someone in your community who's in a similar situation." The audience stood and applauded, but it was a different kind of applause than what had come before. It was respectful. It was moved. It carried the weight of collective recognition that something meaningful had occurred. But what nobody knew at that moment was that Maria's story was just the beginning. This episode would spark a movement that would change the way America thought about poverty, homelessness, and community responsibility. The episode aired on a Tuesday evening, and by Wednesday morning, it had become a cultural phenomenon. Social media exploded with the story of Maria. Hashtags trended worldwide. News outlets picked up the story and ran it on their evening broadcasts. Maria's face appeared on morning talk shows, news programs, and digital platforms across the globe. What had started as an unplanned interruption on a daytime talk show had transformed into a national conversation about poverty, resilience, and human compassion. But the real impact was happening behind the scenes, in ways that the cameras couldn't capture. Within 48 hours of the episode airing, Steve Harvey's production team received over 10,000 emails from viewers who wanted to help. Business owners offered jobs. Real estate developers offered discounted housing. Nonprofits reached out wanting to collaborate on larger initiatives. The outpouring of generosity was staggering and unprecedented. Maria, meanwhile, was experiencing a transformation of her own. She had started her new job at the corporation where Jennifer worked, and she was thriving. Her supervisor quickly realized that Maria was not only competent, but exceptional. She brought a work ethic and gratitude that inspired everyone around her. Within her first month, she had been promoted to a supervisory role. Within 3 months, she was leading a team. But more importantly, Maria had moved into a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood. Sophia and Marcus had their own rooms for the first time in their lives. They had real beds, real furniture, real stability. Sophia's grades improved immediately. Marcus joined the school soccer team. For the first time in years, they were simply children again, not survivors of a crisis. One evening, about 6 months after the episode aired, Maria sat down with her children at their kitchen table, a real kitchen table and a real homeland. She wept with gratitude. Sophia asked her mother why she was crying, and Maria pulled both of her children close. "Because we made it," she whispered. "We actually made it." But Maria's story was just one thread in a much larger tapestry that was being woven across the country. The episode had inspired a movement. Steve Harvey, energized by what had happened with Maria, decided to dedicate a significant portion of his show to highlighting stories of people in crisis and connecting them with resources and community support. He called it the Change Initiative, and it became the centerpiece of his programming. Other talk show hosts noticed the impact and began incorporating similar segments into their shows. News organizations started investigating the systemic issues that created situations like Maria's politicians began receiving. Constituent mail demanding action on housing and employment issues. The conversation had shifted from viewing homelessness and poverty as individual failures to recognizing them as systemic problems that required systemic solutions. In Maria's city, a coalition of business leaders, nonprofits, and government officials came together to address housing insecurity and unemployment. They created a task force dedicated to providing emergency housing and job placement services for people in crisis. They modeled their program after what Steve Harvey had done for Maria, but they scaled it up to help hundreds of people. Other cities followed suit. Within a year, there were similar initiatives in 30 major metropolitan areas across the country. Thousands of people were being helped, people like Maria, who had fallen through the cracks of the system and needed someone to believe in them and provide them with resources to rebuild their lives. But the impact extended even further. Universities began studying what had happened, examining the psychology of compassion and the power of public recognition in motivating community action. Social workers and community organizers pointed to Maria's story as evidence of what was possible when resources were mobilized and systems were activated on behalf of vulnerable populations. Steve Harvey became something more than an entertainer. He became an advocate, a catalyst for change, a voice for the voiceless. His show evolved into a platform for systemic change, and he used his influence and resources to push for policy changes at the state and federal levels. Meanwhile, Maria had become a speaker herself. She traveled to schools and community centers, sharing her story with audiences who needed to hear it. She talked about the shame of homelessness, the resilience required to survive it, and the transformative power of community support. Her message resonated with people who had experienced similar struggles, and it inspired people with resources to take action. 1 year after her appearance on Steve Harvey's show, Maria was invited to speak at a major conference on housing and homelessness. She stood at a podium in front of hundreds of housing advocates, policymakers, and nonprofit leaders, and she told her story. When she finished, the entire room stood and applauded for 5 full minutes. People approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, telling her that her story had changed their perspective, had motivated them to dedicate their careers to solving homelessness. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Sophia and Marcus. They grew up knowing that their mother's crisis had sparked a movement that helped thousands of people. They understood, at a visceral level, the power of community and the importance of lifting up those who were struggling. As they got older, they both became involved in community service. Sophia eventually became a social worker. Marcus became a teacher in an underfunded school district, dedicated to serving students from low-income families. 2 years after the episode aired, Steve Harvey decided to do a follow-up special. He brought Maria back on his show, along with dozens of other people whose lives had been transformed through the Change Initiative. The special aired during prime time and was watched by over 20 million people. It documented the systemic changes that had occurred, the policies that had been implemented, the lives that had been saved. During that special, Steve Harvey sat down with Maria one more time, and he asked her a simple question. If you could go back and change what happened to you, if you could erase those 4 months of living in your car, would you? Maria thought about it for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. No, she said quietly. I wouldn't. Because those 4 months, as painful as they were, led to this. They led to me being here, to my children being safe, to thousands of other people being helped. If my suffering could mean that others don't have to suffer the way I did, then it was worth it. Steve nodded, tears streaming down his face, and the audience erupted in applause. But what neither Steve nor Maria knew at that moment was that their story was about to take an even more unexpected turn that would involve political leadership at the highest levels of government and a fundamental reimagining of how America approached poverty and homelessness. 6 months after the follow-up special aired, Maria received a life-changing phone call from a senior advisor to the President of the United States. The President had been deeply moved by Maria's story and wanted to meet her to discuss how the federal government could better address housing insecurity and homelessness. Maria was invited to the Oval Office, where she shared her experiences candidly. The President listened intently and expressed his commitment to ensuring that no American would face homelessness like Maria did. He then launched the Maria Initiative, a comprehensive federal program aimed at addressing homelessness through increased funding for affordable housing, job training, and wraparound services. The initiative sought to create 1 million new affordable housing units, implement supportive employment programs, and provide preventive measures to keep people from becoming homeless. In its first year, over 200,000 individuals found stable housing, and the initiative gained national attention for its success. Maria became the public face of the Maria Initiative, traveling across the country to advocate for its implementation and sharing her story to inspire others. She was appointed to the President's Council on Homelessness, where she emphasized the importance of including people with lived experience in the design of housing programs. As the initiative progressed, it sparked a national conversation about poverty and homelessness, shifting the perception of these issues as systemic problems requiring coordinated government responses rather than individual failures. Mariah's journey, from living in her car to becoming a national advocate, inspired real change in policies and communities throughout the country. However, as the initiative grew, some critics raised concerns about its bureaucratic nature, urging for greater community involvement and maintaining the human element of the programs. 4 years later, the President announced his re-election campaign, with the Maria Initiative central to his platform. Maria's story had become a symbol of effective government action and a focal point in the ongoing debate about the role of government in addressing social issues. The 2024 presidential election turned contentious, with the Maria Initiative at its center. The president's opponent criticized the initiative as government overreach and a failure, arguing that private enterprise should handle homelessness. In response, the president highlighted the initiative's successes, including reducing homelessness by 40% and housing over 2 million people. Maria became a key figure in the campaign, advocating for the initiative and sharing her story. The election ultimately became a referendum on the role of government in addressing social issues, with voters prioritizing homelessness supporting the president. He won re-election, but faced challenges from a divided Congress, where the opposition launched investigations into the initiative. During congressional hearings, Maria defended the program against hostile questioning, emphasizing that her experience demonstrated the need for community support alongside personal responsibility. Her powerful responses gained public attention and went viral, reinforcing support for the initiative. Despite ongoing political attacks, the Maria Initiative expanded, housing millions and demonstrating significant improvements in health and employment outcomes. However, political divisions deepened as the opposition promised to dismantle it if they gained power. Concerned about the future of the initiative, Maria founded Housing for All, a non-profit dedicated to advocating for housing justice at local and state levels. The organization quickly grew, uniting various stakeholders around the mission of ensuring safe, stable, affordable housing for all. Sophia and Marcus became actively involved in Housing for All, furthering the family's commitment to housing justice. As the next presidential election approached, the future of the Maria Initiative and federal support for homelessness would hinge on the outcome and the public's commitment to prioritizing housing as a national issue.